知識論嘅形而上學第12講，我哋嚟到普遍啟示4個屬性嘅最後一個啦。記唔記得啊？前邊我哋話普遍啟示、自然啟示，第一佢係必須性嘅，為咗特殊啟示作一個平台個 platform， 俾神做區分嘅工作。因為神嘅特殊即係救贖啟示係例外嘅，普遍啟示做一個常規。第二係權威性嘅，自然啟示同聖經一樣有同樣嘅權威，因為都係神所賜下嘅。第三係足夠嘅，普遍啟示足夠，叫人無可推諉，亦都係足夠俾救贖啟示一個平台。普遍啟示嘅目的唔係教人點樣得救嘅，嗰個唔係普遍啟示嘅目的，所以佢嗰方面唔需要考慮佢夠唔夠，佢足夠為救贖啟示嗰個區分做一個平台。好啦，我哋而家嚟到呢 D 普遍啟示嘅清晰性。General revelation is perspicuous or clear。普遍啟示係清晰嘅。嗱，呢度呢有至少2個 point 好重要，要同時掌握嘅。God is incomprehensible and the world is cursed。神係唔能夠透知嘅，世界亦都係被咒詛咗。Nevertheless, the world reveals God clearly。但係世界、自然界仍然好清楚嘅彰顯神嘅，即係話呢，一方面神係唔可以透知，冇錯，我哋已經嚟到墮落嗰個階段啦。但係諸天仍然在述說神的榮耀嘅，自然世界仍然清楚顯示神嘅。呢個 A。B although clear in itself, general revelation is not properly understood by sinful men。但係呢，雖然自然啟示、普遍啟示係清楚嘅，但係罪人係冇正確理解佢咁。聖經話罪人係阻擋真理嘅。下低有一句説話，2句説話好重要㗎，慢慢去答嘅。Until 喺 Nature and Scripture 呢篇文章280話 For any fact to be a fact, it must be a revelation of fact。佢話點樣嘅事實先至算係事實呢？一定係啟示上帝、彰顯上帝嘅，咁先算係事實嘅。即係冇中立嘅，冇客觀嘅，唔使考慮神都可以知道嘅真正事實咁。It is accordingly no easier for sinners to accept God's revelation in nature than to accept God's revelation in Scripture。所以呢，一個罪人係唔可能接受神喺自然界啟示，除非佢重生，就等於一個罪人唔可能接受聖經裏邊嘅啟示一樣。因為所有嘅事實，從自然界到聖經，全部都喺度述說緊神嘅榮耀，全部都喺度做緊啟示嘅。所以呢，罪人係唔可能冇能力去接受神嘅自然啟示同埋聖經啟示嘅。但唔好唔記得我翻轉頭 A 喎，自然啟示仍然係清楚嘅。R.C. Sproul 做個比喻，佢話譬如有個人咧坐喺一間黑色，全部油漆油到黑咪掹嘅一間房間裏邊，冇窗冇光，外邊呢，中午12點，太陽都唔知照到幾猛。咁坐喺呢個黑室裏邊嘅人呢，我仲有係眼盲嘅添，佢唔願意睇，佢睇唔到，又冇能力睇，唔等於太陽唔清楚照耀。太陽清楚照耀，佢睇唔到，亦都唔能夠睇，亦都唔想睇，佢都唔想出去外面望一望，因為佢有盲眼啦。第8 Summary。General revelation and special revelation are equally necessary, authoritative, sufficient, and perspicuous。所以普遍啟示同埋自然啟示同樣嘅同等地必須，同等地有權威，同等地足夠，同等地清楚嘅。The uniqueness of special revelation is not that it is more authoritative than natural revelation。特殊啟示即係聖經，點解係獨特別呢？唔係因為佢比自然啟示更加具有權威， 或者其他三個屬性，唔係嘅。Rather, special revelation is unique because it is given for distinct purposes，唔係嘅。特殊啟示點解係獨特嘅呢？即係聖經點獨特呢？因為神有3個特別嘅原因點解俾我哋聖經嘅啟示。第一 ，to guide our interpretation of general revelation。第一，聖經啟示要指引我哋點樣去解釋自然啟示，即係聖經係一本教導我哋點樣從事科學嘅書嚟嘅。第二個目的 ，after the fall, to correct our sinful distortions of general revelation。第二，人類墮落之後呢，聖經啟示要糾正我哋點樣身為罪人呢，扭曲咗自然啟示，上帝扭翻正，排除我哋嗰啲錯誤嘅，不論係世俗科學、世俗心理學、世俗哲學嗰啲對上帝自然啟示嘅理解。第三個目的 ，to bring us God's promise of salvation to Christ, a message not available through general revelation。第三就係聖經帶俾我哋上帝藉著基督所成就嘅救恩嘅應許。咁呢樣嘢咧，普遍啟示係做唔到嘅。好啦，我哋講完咗普遍啟示4個特別嘅屬性啦。咁未講聖經之前咧，呢個有第3段嘅 perspectivalism。嗱，呢一段咧真係要的起心肝嚇，去聽咁。Fantel develops in Introduction to Systematic Theology his ideas on the integration of general and special revelation。Fantel 寫一本書叫做《啟通神學導論》，佢就將普遍啟示同埋特殊啟示整合起來嘅。Interestingly, at this point he resorts to a threefold rather than twofold distinction。好有趣的是，講到普遍啟示同埋聖經點樣整合嘅時候呢，佢係3分法，唔係2分法㗎。Instead of the traditional general special distinction， 佢唔係話普遍特殊咁樣2分法，唔係。He refers to revelation from God, revelation from nature, and from self。佢就分3樣嘢，從神而來嘅啟示，從自然界嚟嘅啟示，同埋從人入邊而嚟嘅啟示，因為人自己就係神嘅啟示。This is reminiscent of the first page of Calvin's Institutes。咁呢個就係我哋諗起咧，加爾文基督教要義第1頁，in which he declares the inseparability of our knowledge of self from our knowledge of God。加爾文話我哋認識神同埋認識自己呢兩個認識係分唔開嘅。Each is involved in the other。其中一方面就牽涉到另外一方面。And he does not know which comes first。咁佢都唔知道話對神嘅認識先過對人自己認識咧，定係反之，唔知道嘅。Relating these to another triad。好啦，從神而嚟，從自然界而嚟，從自己而嚟嘅啟示或者知識，而家要同另外3樣嘢連接，就係 revelation about God, about nature, about self， 就係關於神嘅啟示，關於自然界啟示，關於自己嘅啟示。He ends up with 9 categories。咁咧就搞出9個範圍出嚟啦。譬如話 revelation about nature， 我哋點樣知道關於自然界嘅事情呢？ From nature, from self and God。 關於自然界嘅事，我哋可以從自然界去認識，當然要正確認識；從自己認識，當然要正確嘅認識，同埋從神而來嘅認識。Revelation about self， 我哋點可以自我認識呢？透過自然界，透過自己入邊神嘅啟示，同埋從神而來。And revelation about God， 仲有我哋點樣認識神呢？透過自然界嘅啟示，透過人裏邊嗰個神嘅啟示，同埋透過神而來嘅啟示。Somewhat tongue in cheek, Fantil gives to each relation a technical title。咁咧，凡提要好似認真又好似唔係好認真咁咧，將呢9個範圍咧就安咗9個名㗎，9個唔同嘅學科，好似一個百科全書嘅9個範圍咁樣樣。For example, revelation about nature from nature is physics。譬如話從自然界講俾我哋聽關於自然界嗰個學問就叫物理學。Revelation about nature from self is psychophysics。而從自己人而來嘅對自然界認識叫做心理物理學等等。Number 2， 第2點 ，revelation and knowledge， 啟示同埋知識，佢哋嘅相互依賴。All 3 sources are involved in the knowledge of any subject。無論你要認識乜嘢，咩題目，係自然界咧， 定係認識自己，或者認識神，都係牽連到呢3個唔同嘅來源㗎，從神、從自然界同埋從人。But more important, he argues that each relationship must be understood from a Christian theistic perspective. 但係每一個關係呢，必須要從一個基督教有神論嘅角度去睇㗎。These insights of Van Til's are one major source of the perspectivalism expounded in my Doctrine of Knowledge of God, John Frame。Frame 話呢，Van Til 咁樣講呢，就特別係啟迪咗我喺我嗰本神學認識論裏邊呢講個視覺主義㗎。As we understand revelation about nature from nature, for example， 譬如話，當我哋從自然界去睇自然界嘅時候呢 ，it is important that we recognize that nature is created and governed by God。我哋必須要承認，我再講一次啊，從自然界去睇自然界，睇自然界從事科學嘅時候呢，我哋必須承認自然界係神所創造、神所統治嘅。Therefore, all facts are governed by laws, and all laws are related to facts。因此，所有事實都係由定律所管理，所有嘅定律都係與事實相關㗎。And both facts and laws are what they are because of God。而事實之所以事實，定律之所以定律，都係因為神。Apart from His plan, they could not exist in fruitful relation。假如冇神嘅預定計劃嘅話呢，事實同埋定律之間唔可能有一個正常有用嘅關係㗎。Van Til eschews both traditional empiricism and traditional a priorism. Facts apart from laws and laws apart from facts are both meaningless。范太爾避免咗世俗哲學裏邊嘅經驗主義，即係洛克啊、幽默啊等等，亦都避免咗哲學上嘅理性主義或者先驗主義。咩叫經驗主義呢？ Facts apart from laws， 一大扎嘅事實亂七八糟，冇定律去管，或者反過嚟呢個叫經驗主義。反過嚟一大扎嘅定律喺我哋頭腦裏邊，但係同外界事實冇關嘅，呢個叫做理性主義或者先驗主義。兩者都冇意思嘅噃。你而家宇宙乜都係亂七八糟，係進化嘅，係偶然嘅，咁即係冇定律咯。咁你點樣研究任何嘢呢？冇用㗎，一紮亂七八糟嘅事實，散收收，宇宙散收收。反過嚟，你有大紮嘅定律喺你頭腦裏邊，但係同外界冇關嘅，咁係點啫？自己入邊諗，自己諗到傻咗咁咯，冇用㗎。Without God to relate the facts and the laws intelligibly, knowledge is impossible。除非有神，佢將真正嗰啲事實同埋真正嘅定律連接起來，使人知道。除非係咁，唔係話人唔可能有任何知識嘅。Thus we see that for Van Til, the knowledge of God enters even into a consideration of revelation about nature from nature。所以咧，對阿 Van Til 嚟講咧，就算我哋研究緊自然界科學，從自然界睇科學咧，你都唔可能唔考慮認識神嘅。第四，宗教同埋科學係分唔開嘅。Revelation about nature from self is also important。好啦，研究自然界，從人嘅內心、理智、良心等等去研究自然界，呢一種嘅學問都好重要㗎。Since we learn much about nature by comparing it with ourselves， 因為當我哋研究自然界嘅時候呢，我哋總會將自然界同埋我自己去比較一下嘅。But to do this properly, we must have a biblical concept of self。但係假如當我哋將自己同埋自然界比較嘅時候，我哋必須要有聖經嘅人觀㗎，即係你唔可以認為人同自然界一樣嘅。不論係新紀元或者進化論。Revelation about nature from God therefore is crucial。所以最關鍵性咩呢？就係從神而來嘅關於自然界嘅啟示。It is God who tells us, both in natural revelation and spiritual revelation, that the world is created and cursed。邊個話俾我哋聽自然界係神所做嘅，而且係受咗咒詛呢？只有神話俾我哋聽，透過自然啟示同埋聖經，神話俾我哋聽呢個世界係佢做嘅。亦都係佢所咒詛咗嘅。We may not therefore compartmentalize religion and science。所以我哋唔可以將宗教同埋科學咧分得好遠，唔得嘅。Van Til話 Even in paradise, God expected man to study nature in the light of His spoken word。就算喺伊甸園咧，神都要人咧 用佢自己所講嘅説話嚟研究自然界嘅。第五，咁墮落之後呢，普遍啟示仍然係清楚嘅。In the next 3 chapters of Introduction to Systematic Theology, Van Til discusses the effects of the fall upon God's revelation about man, nature, man and God. 好啦，喺系統神學導論呢本書，接下嚟3章，Van Til呢就討論佢話人墮落咗啦，咁人嘅墮落呢對有咩影響呢？點樣影響到神關於自然界啟示呢？點樣影響到神關於人嘅啟示呢？點樣影響到神對佢自己啟示呢 ？We shall consider this material in part 3, the ethics of knowledge。咁喺呢本書 Cornelius Van Til 呢本書嘅第3部分，知識論嘅倫理學呢，我哋會討論呢啲問題嘅。In general， 而家先俾大家一個預演。The revelation remains clear。神嘅啟示喺人墮落之後仍然係清楚嘅。Although it reflects the curse on the earth。雖然神嘅自然啟示係反映出神已經咒詛咗自然界，咒詛咗個地球。And although man sinfully distorts the truth, he learns from it。所以雖然人犯罪，扭曲真理本身係一個罪。雖然人咁樣做，但係佢仍然可以從自然界去學習認識神嘅。再嚟一次啊！神喺墮落咗嘅世界裏邊，佢嘅普遍啟示仍然係清楚嘅。神嘅自然啟示而家反映出佢咒詛地球，人又扭曲呢啲嘅事實，但係人仍然可以學習認識神嘅，就喺自然界裏邊仍然可以學習。即係話咧，諸天仍然述説神嘅榮耀㗎，雖然神咒詛咗宇宙。第6點 ，Sola Scriptura and extra-biblical knowledge， 唯獨聖經同埋聖經以外嘅知識。Certainly, Van Til believed in Sola Scriptura in a traditional Protestant sense。Van Til 當然相信呢傳統基督教所講嘅唯獨聖經 ，that only Scripture serves as a supreme authority for human thought and life。唯有聖經係人類所有嘅思想生活嘅最高權威嚟㗎。包括科學啦，包括哲學啦。We shall see in the next chapter how Scripture was Van Til's presupposition。我哋下一章講到預設嘅問題咧，我哋就會看見咧，Van Til認為認為聖經係佢嘅 presupposition， 聖經係佢嘅前提，係佢嘅堅持嚟㗎。Nevertheless, Van Til did not hold a mechanical view of sola scriptura, as if we could develop a knowledge from Scripture alone without any use of our own reason or senses。不過Van Til講到 sola scriptura 唯獨聖經嘅時候咧，佢唔係好似機械性咁嘅，唔係話我哋淨係用聖經，唔使用我哋嘅理性，唔使用我哋嘅五官觀察，就可以就咁齋讀聖經就可以認識聖經㗎啦。He understood， 佢明白嘅。In any instance of knowledge, there is simultaneous knowledge of God, the world, and the self。無論你想知道咩東咧，你係同時去認識神、認識世界同埋認識自己嘅。We cannot know one thing without relating it to other things and to ourselves。你唔可以認識一樣嘢，認識神、認識聖經，而唔將呢個認識同認識自己、認識其他嘢擸埋一齊嘅，唔可能嘅。我舉個例，你唔可能齋讀聖經嘅噃。你刷牙唔可以背經㗎嘛？出嚟揸車，除非你由朝到晚乜都唔做，淨係朗誦聖經。咁你刷牙揸車返工，你要用聖經以外嘅一啲知識同埋字眼㗎嘛，唔可能唔用㗎。We cannot know God rightly unless we know Him as Creator of the world and as our own Creator Redeemer。簡單啲嚟講，我哋需要認識神係世界嘅創造者，係我哋嘅創造主，係我哋嘅救贖主，咁先至可以正確認識我哋嘅神嘅。We cannot know Scripture without relating it to ourselves and to the world of experience。你唔可能唔將聖經同我哋自己擸上關係，同埋我哋所經驗嘅世界拉上關係，唔可能咁樣認識聖經嘅。General and special revelation always work together。自然啟示或者普遍啟示同埋聖經永遠係一同工嘅。 although certainly the latter must provide the ultimate criteria for understanding the former. 當然，唯有聖經俾我哋最高嘅準則，點樣去了解自然啟示。第7點 ，General revelation and special revelation forms one whole forms one whole. They are mutually limiting concepts. 普遍啟示同埋特殊啟示咧，成為一個真理嘅系統，佢哋彼此係對方嘅界線或者界限觀念嚟㗎。We should note especially that in this scheme, revelation from nature and revelation from man are not isolated from revelation of God, from God. 喺呢一個整個分出9個範圍呢個架構裏邊咧，從自然界來的啟示同埋從人來的啟示咧，係唔會分割到同從上帝來嘅啟示排得分開孤立嘅，唔係咁嘅。Even revelation about nature from nature must be understood in the scriptural way. 就算你係從自然界嚟嘅，關於自然界嘅啟示咧，都必須要從一個合乎聖經嘅方法去理解㗎。Indeed, nature, man, and God must all be understood in the light of one another. 認識自然、認識人、認識神，你都每一樣都必須參照另外嗰兩樣，先至有真正嘅知識㗎。Even in theology proper， 就算你淨係講神學本身。The revelation about God from God， 即係話從神而來嘅關於神嘅知識，關於神嘅啟示。就算講神學都好啦。We cannot artificially separate the knowledge of God that man received or could receive by his reflection on man and the created universe in general, and the knowledge of God that man received from God by direct communication。好啦，我哋講到從神而來關於神嘅啟示，你都要考慮到第一，當然啦，神直接啟示嘅聖經嘅啟示。另外呢，人自我反省人是什麼時候，都會學到關於神嘅，同埋默想神所做嘅宇宙嘅時候咧，你都會認識一啲關於神嘅嘢㗎，分唔開。第一條咁樣講，喺系統神學導論嘅第2版嘅第136頁咁樣講，佢話 What God did actually reveal directly, and what God revealed naturally to man, together form one system of truth。佢話神親自自己所啟示俾人嘅，同埋神藉着自然界或者人嘅本性啟示俾人嘅啟示呢，兩者形成一個整體嘅真理系統嚟。God had one comprehensive plan with respect to the universe, inclusive of his natural and supernatural revelation。神有一個完整嘅計劃㗎，對宇宙有一個計劃，即係冇兩個嘅，係包含咗佢嘅自然啟示同埋特殊啟示嘅，同埋超自然啟示嘅。It is of great importance that the various aspects of revelation be regarded as implying one another. They are limiting concepts of one another。所以啟示嘅唔同嘅層面咧，係彼此牽連、彼此暗示、彼此係界限嘅概念嚟㗎。第8個 point， interdependence is perspectivalism。呢種唔同層面啟示即係相互依賴咧，就係 Frame 所講嘅視覺主義 perspectivalism。When Ventil says in above quotation that natural and supernatural revelation are limiting concepts of one another, I believe he means that there is no purely natural revelation or purely supernatural revelation without an admixture of the other。咁當范太爾上面嗰段話，佢話咧，自然啟示同埋超自然啟示係彼此做界限概念嘅時候，佢意思係咩咧？阿 Frame 話冇一種純粹嘅自然啟示冇參咗一啲超自然啟示嘅，亦都冇一種嘅純粹嘅超自然啟示冇參咗一啲自然啟示入邊㗎。界限觀念 limiting concept， 好，下低係一個注腳嚟㗎。阿 Frame 咁樣去解釋，佢話 limiting concept is a term used by Immanuel Kant and later philosophers。佢話界限概念咧係康德同埋康德之後嘅哲學家好中意用㗎。Mathematical infinity is a limiting concept。譬如話喺數學裏邊嗰個無限大、無限係一個界限概念。 Because although we can use the concept meaningfully in calculations, there are no actually infinite quantities. 因為我哋雖然喺數學裏面去計算嘅時候，我哋可以用無限大呢個概念好有用嘅，但係事實上呢個世界上冇咩嘢係無限大嘅。Limiting concepts are useful for analytical purposes. 當我哋去分析宇宙嘅時候呢，呢啲咁嘅界限概念係有用嘅。But they do not literally represent something that exists. 但係我哋講到無限大嘅時候，呢啲界限概念本身呢係不存在㗎。嗱，我再舉個例，譬如 number 2 2，好啦，一有1/2，一有3/4，一有7%，一有32/31等等，你一路咁講落去咧，你講唔到2嘅噃。但係2係嗰個界限嗰個概念，好有用，對呢一系列嘅 number 好有用，但佢本身唔屬於呢一個系列呢個 series 裏邊㗎。好，我哋翻去正文啊，阿 Frame 話咧 ，The natural must be understood in the light of the supernatural, and the supernatural must be understood against the backdrop of the natural。自然界嘅嘢呢，必須要有超自然啟示嗰個觀點先能夠理解㗎。超自然啟示亦都需要從自然嗰個平台去理解㗎。Apart from these contexts, they do not actually function as revelation。除非你睇到自然啟示同埋超自然啟示一個整體，唔係話咧自然啟示、超自然啟示都做唔到啟示呢樣嘢嘅。阿 Frame 就話 ：I have elsewhere described this sort of view as perspectivalism。阿 Frame 話嗱，我喺我啲書裏邊咧形容呢樣嘢叫做 perspectivalism。視覺主義 ，that is, all human knowledge is simultaneously knowledge of self, knowledge of the world, and knowledge of God。人類所有嘅知識同時係自我認識、對世界認識同埋對神嘅認識嘅，同時嘅 knowledge of one area cannot be adequate with the knowledge of the other two。喺一方面一個層面嘅一個範圍嘅認識咧，唔可能唔參其他嗰兩個範圍裏邊，唔係嘅話就唔足夠嘅。One cannot know the self rightly without knowing God。你想自我認識嘛？你必須認識神。同樣嘅，另外嗰兩種認識都一樣嘅。Therefore, self-knowledge is really a knowledge of all three areas。所以自我認識係其實係對自我、對神同埋對世界認識，同時三樣嘢。With a focus on the self。當然個焦點側重點係認識自我。Self-knowledge in this case becomes a perspective on the entire tribe。所以自我認識係一種嘅視覺，讓我哋認識呢三樣嘢。好啦，到到第9點嘅時候呢，阿 Frame 就話：咁我哋需唔需要區別翻自然神學同埋同埋超自然嘅神學呢？我哋仲需唔需要神學呢？Van Til does say in the concept of the last quotation that natural and supernatural theology must be nevertheless kept distinct。不過上邊Van Til講嗰段説話咧，佢的確有咁講，佢話咧自然嘅神學同自然界嚟嘅神學，同埋從超自然啟示嚟嘅神學咧，要必須區分。The distinctness is a distinctness of content。點解要區分咧？因為佢哋嘅內容唔同。Van Til咁樣講 ：If we keep them distinct at this place, it will help us when we come to the question of what can, now that sin entered the world, still be known of God by the process of natural and rational theology, and what must be reserved for theology proper。佢話：假如我哋喺而家就開始分開下，從自然界嚟嘅神學同埋從超自然嚟嘅神學咧，你分清楚嘅話咧，就幫我哋下面要回答一個問題啦。咩問題咧？就既然罪進入咗世界啊，我哋仲可唔可以透過自然啟示建造神學咧？我哋仲可唔可以透過人嘅理性去建立神學咧？有啲乜嘢留翻俾神學去做嗰啲做神學功夫嘅呢？ Here observe Van Til is simply making the traditional distinction between natural theology as communicating God's nature and wrath, and revealed theology as communicating the gospel。我認為 Van Til 呢度只不過係做一個好傳統嘅二分法。佢一方面從自然界嚟嘅神學係傳遞緊神嘅本性同埋憤怒，從啟示而來嘅神學咧係傳遞緊福音。Natural and special revelation therefore different context。所以自然界而嚟嗰個啟示同埋知識咧，同埋聖經嚟嘅知識嘅內容係唔同。But to understand and to apply each other properly, we need the other。但係你而家要理解聖經或者理解自然界，你必須要用翻另外個 嗰個範圍嘅啟示嘅。Van Til's perspectivalism must not be taken in a leveling way so that all God's messages become identical. Van Til 嘅視覺主義，你又唔可以認為咁神所有啟示全部一樣，又唔得。Rather, it calls us to recognize both the integrity of each revelation and the interdependence of all of God's revelations. 唔係嘅。Van Til 要我哋承認，第一，每一種嘅啟示有佢自己嘅獨特性，佢自己嘅整全性。第二，神所有唔同種類嘅啟示呢，係彼此相互依賴嘅。For revelation is after all like creation, a manifestation of the divine Trinity。因為呢，啟示同埋呢個宇宙一樣，係彰顯緊三一真神一而終嘅。好啦，我哋講到呢度呢，就暫停。下一次呢，我哋就會進入到特殊啟示同埋聖經啦。